You're listening to the Talking Headways Podcast Network.
Talking Mondays. Keep moving on. Keep moving on. Talking Mondays. Keep moving on. Keep moving on. Talking Mondays. Keep moving on.
Happy Monday. This is Mondays at the Overhead Wire, sponsored by our super generous Patreon supporters. I'm Jeff Wood, your host, and joined by Han Solo. That's right. Every Wookiee's favorite right-hand man is here to help us through the show. But as we do, and we're Han Solo, we've got a preview of some Talking Headways episodes upcoming. Last week, David Hensher joined the show to talk about his ideas for fixing mobility as a service. You know, I thought it was really interesting, and I thought it could really work with things like cap and trade schemes that some states are putting forward and funding reductions in travel through encouraging mode shift. So it's interesting to think about that and think about how, you know, credit card companies, insurance companies, and the like could actually get involved in reducing travel, unlike transportation companies, which apparently David and Sampo were not fans of because they haven't really hit the nail on the head when it comes to MaaS. So interesting stuff last week on that. Yona's coming up this week, Yona Freemark, and so we're really excited to share that episode with you. It'll be a longer episode, probably about an hour. And so we talked about a whole bunch of stuff, including some things that actually we recorded it right before some things happened in Philadelphia. So look out for that. It's really exciting to hear what we proposed in terms of our predictions and what we got right, what we got wrong from last year. So check that out if you get a chance this Thursday. Trevor Latimer joined me last Thursday to talk about Small Isn't Beautiful. That show will be coming up in a few weeks. He wrote a really interesting book, and a deep philosophical debate was had about localism, and I recommend taking a listen when it comes out. I hope that folks listen with the open ears. I think I might have had some interesting questions for him, and I think it was fun to have him on the show and talk about his ideas, and I think you'll appreciate the conversation as well. We've also got a number of other books coming up, so I'm actually excited. The spring is for books, I guess. So The First City on Mars by Justin Hollander is coming. When Public Space Matters by Seth Lowe, we have that scheduled. Urban Jungle by Ben Wilson is there as well. And hopefully we get to chat with Bruce Appleyard about his Livable Street 2.0. I have that big tome sitting on my desk and looking forward to thumbing through that as well. We've also got the folks from WRI coming on to talk about zero emissions deliveries, and Denver folks are coming on to talk about the e-bike rebates that are happening there that have been really popular. So I'm really, really excited about all these shows coming up, and I hope you appreciate all the topics we cover. We try to kind of go outside the norm with this show and with Talking Headways. You know, we could talk about popular topics, I think, that everybody's talking about, which we do a little bit sometimes here, but I try to kind of, you know, make it a little bit more exciting, a little bit more interesting for folks who already follow the national news but want something a little bit different here. And I'm really excited to do that and share information about what's going on. So really cool stuff coming up on the Talking Headways podcast. And so thanks everybody who's been ordering bus and bike scarves. We really appreciate it. And if you go to order@theoverheadwire.com, you can do that. And if you want 5 or more and you want a 10% discount, email me at theoverheadwire@gmail.com and I'll do that for you. Really, really appreciate everybody who's been ordering scarves. Folks have been ordering all 3 types. So appreciate sending those out. I like going to the post office and dropping them off and sending them out. So keep ordering and we'll keep sending them. And it's still cold outside in some places. So get your scarves before summer. And in the summertime, you can get the lightweight scarf, the lightweight bike only scarf, which is really cool. And literally cooler than the heavyweight bus and bike scarves. And also, don't forget to order any of the books we've covered on the show on the bookshop site, bookshops.org/shop/theoverheadwire, bookshop.org/shop/theoverheadwire. Really, there's a ton of books on there that are really cool that we've had the authors on talking about their books. And so if you want the book and you want to go through Bookshop, definitely check that out if you get a chance, bookshop.org/shop/theoverheadwire. And also, we have created the Cars Are Cholesterol sticker and shirt and everything else. And you can get that at TeePublic, Cars Are Cholesterol. It's a really cool design done by Richard Wozensky, who's a bike advocate in Dallas-Fort Worth area. And hopefully folks get a chance to check that out and order a shirt. You can use bit.ly/Cars Are Cholesterol. And I always advocate getting the purple one. So, with that being said, this is episode 129 of the Monday Show. We're in session. I can't believe we've done 129 shows, plus the 425 shows of Talking Headways. We're over 500 shows for the channel, and I'm excited about that too. That's crazy. I hadn't thought about that when we hit 500, but it just dawned on me to do the math and put that together. Like, oh yeah, we've done 500 plus shows on this channel with varying topics, and hopefully a lot of them evergreen, so people can always go back and listen to ones in the past and check those out as well. We get a lot of people actually downloading the old shows too, which is really great. So appreciate that. So thanks so much for listening and checking out our network of shows here at the Talking Headways Podcast Network. Well, before we get to the show, I want to let folks know that they can get this podcast and this feed, Talking Headways, wherever you find your podcasts, including iHeartRadio, Spotify, Overcast, Stitcher, and of course, Apple Podcasts. Thanks to everybody who subscribes to podcatchers. It's awesome. You guys keep coming back to the show. We really do appreciate it. Seriously, it's awesome that you guys keep coming back, keep listening, keep downloading. And yeah, I can't even express my thanks for everybody listening. Otherwise, it would just be me talking into the void, and that's no good for anybody, including myself, I think. Well, maybe it would be good for me just to talk into a void. Nobody would have to hear my opinions, but that's okay. So here's the news. Here are a few stories that have piqued our interest from the newsletter over the last few weeks. Go get a 2-week free trial of the newsletter. No credit card needed. Just give us your email address. And if you ask us to delete it, we'll delete it. We're not like those other companies or organizations that will switch you to another list once you unsubscribe. I actually keep the list pretty clean. We started out, I think, at Reconnecting America with about 16,000 people on the list, and it's been whittled down to people that really pay attention, and I clean it pretty frequently. So if you don't want to be there, I don't need you to be there either. It actually costs a lot of money to keep people on lists, which I don't understand why so many organizations or folks do that, especially when they're sending to places that don't even want you to click on it, or if they're just spam. That makes sense, I guess. They get a lot more money through connecting to more people, I guess, but who clicks on that anyway? So anyways, free trial, theoverheadwire.com, sign up for the newsletter, 2 weeks of trial, and you don't need a credit card or anything like that, just your email address. Check it out if you get a chance, because this is what you get in the newsletter. All these great articles that we talk about. We go through about 1,500 a day and pull out the 30 we think are the most interesting. And then when we do this show, we take some of the most interesting to folks and we talk about them in more detail. First up is apartment phobia driving the housing crisis. For some reason, I can't read today. Over the last 10 years, the number of housing units per 1,000 people in the United States has fallen, leading to a huge shortage of housing. The number of households is increasing, making the problem even more acute. Eric Levitz believes that the shortage is in part caused by a phobia of apartments written into zoning codes over time. The enforcement of these codes, he says, likely reinforce the antipathy towards high-density development that continues. Eric Levitz in New York Magazine. So he wasn't actually arguing, as some people have mentioned, that, generally people now have apartment phobia. He's mostly talking about how in the past, when zoning codes were created, there was more of a kind of a rural agrarian kind of focus in the United States. And that kind of, I want my single family home, or I want my home with space, kind of sunk into the consciousness, and zoning codes reinforced that and really made it harder to build other homes. I'm sure, if there was no zoning codes, or the zoning codes were different, that more housing, missing middle type housing, urban housing, dense housing would have been built. I mean, look at what was built in New York City and San Francisco and other older cities, Boston, Philadelphia, before the major part of the automobile age. And you can see, people wanted to live close to where they needed to get to access things. And the car just kind of messed that up to a certain extent. And it led to kind of people thinking that more space was better. But what happened was we're paying for that over the long term. And I don't begrudge anybody who wants to live in suburban lifestyle or wants to live a rural lifestyle for that matter. But the zoning codes have distorted our markets such that you overbuilt some of those housing markets, and you underbuilt in the urban areas. I mean, that's why housing in urban areas is so expensive, because so many people can't live there, and it drives the cost up. Okay, it's getting harder for Americans to afford to drive. As income inequality in the United States becomes more pronounced, more and more people are unable to afford to drive in a country that has designed itself to make it mandatory in most places to access jobs, schools, and healthcare. New research has found that wealth is a big determinant in whether an individual has access to a car. Among the poorest in America, half of their trips occur without motorized transportation. And this was by Matthew Rosa in Salon. And this was actually a research paper by John Rennie and team. And John is an old friend. I think John's been on the show a couple times, and he does really great research. He was doing some really cool TOD work up at Rutgers, and then moved down to Florida. Started doing really, really great work down there. And I think this is really interesting, taking kind of that data about who drives and who can afford to drive, and what their trips are like. And so, among the poorest people in America, half their trips occur without motorized transportation. That's pretty intense, right? I mean, that's a lot of people without access to cars. And that's kind of, going towards the previous article about suburbanization and requirement of driving. If we build these places that require driving, and yet most people that live in them can't drive, that's a real barrier to accessing destinations, to jobs, to healthcare, to all these things. And I think that's really an important discussion to have, is that, we might have some sort of weird preference for some folks to live in a certain lifestyle, but not everybody can afford that, and not everybody also has access to that. And so when we restrict the transportation options that are available to people, that actually restricts them from doing other things and being, productive members of society, because we've designed it that way. And so this actually kind of, reinforces that in my mind. And I think, one of the things apparently in the research says that wealth is a determinant about whether you have access to a car. And if you don't, you're going to have to figure out other ways to get around. And if you're in a place that doesn't have transit, or you can't ride your bike, or you can't walk to get up to a place, you might just be stuck. We should not commodify natural light. The idea of windowless bedrooms as a way to build more housing and solve our shortages has been promoted by profit-seeking developers, billionaire dorm designers, and the usual self-proclaimed centrists. But Kate Wagner argues that the commodification of sunlight should not even be allowed into anyone's thought process, and the real reasons for housing shortages are political, not because bedrooms can't have windows. This was by Kate Wagner in The Nation. Kate does the wonderful McMansion Hell blog. I think she makes a really great point. I don't think we should ever consider going back to the ghettos and the tenement houses of old New York. You need light wells, you need access to light. It tells you, it's a health issue, circadian rhythm. I don't care if you have a light that actually, mimics the sun, which is a really good idea in places where it gets dark early and things like that, to keep away seasonal affective disorder and those types of things. But I don't think that natural light should be precluded, and in bedrooms for that matter. And there's a reason why there's rules and regulations for that specific topic. And so I think this is not the reason why we don't have housing, is because we can't have windowless bedrooms. It's actually political, like Kate says. And we've talked about this many, many times before. We just need to build more housing. We need to let people build more housing in places where developers and people would pay for it. I mean, it just makes sense. It's common sense. And I just don't see why we have this, fear of new housing units, fear of building a few more units next to us. I mean, across the street, I've got it used to be 3 Victorian houses, probably in the 60s and 70s, and it got built in probably 25 to 50 units. I don't know how many units are in that building. And it's frustrating because their fire alarms kind of suck, but, they're there, and they built some ADUs, and I was more than happy to, allow them to do that, unlike some of my neighbors on the other side of the street, which were not fans of the idea because of parking concerns. But, that's how we get more people to live in our cities. This is how we allow more people to live in our neighborhoods, is allowing more housing. And if it's if there's space and we can build windows, then let's do it. Walking around is empowering for children. In 2019, Holly Weir of Westminster University spent time with kids, asking them about how they traveled and how being able to walk around their neighborhoods impacted them. What she found in this limited sample of children was that having the autonomy of walking around gave them a greater sense of well-being and navigational skills. This was Holly Weir in The Conversation. This is a really cool kind of study that she did, and it was before the pandemic. And basically, she hung out with kids and asked them why it was so important that they were able to walk either with their parents or walk without their parents to get to places. Some kids actually complained that they weren't allowed to walk and that they couldn't just go to meet their friends. And then sometimes their moms and dads said, well, we're not going to drive you over there, so you can play here. So it kept them actually away from their friends and playing with other kids. And so the interesting thing about this research to me, and it was only like a limited number of kids, I think it was like 19 kids or something like that, maybe even less, is that they actually felt very empowered by the ability to walk. They didn't have to wait for somebody else to allow them to go somewhere. They didn't, they could actually, survey their surroundings. They knew their surroundings, where they were. And also they had an idea of kind of self-reliance. And I think that's really important. When I lived in Bakersfield in California, I would walk to school in third grade. And, basically I every day I'd walk to school, and then every day I'd walk back, and there was a route that I took, and I can remember even vividly right now, all the houses along the line. I knew where my friends lived. I could point them out each time. I knew where family friends lived, where we went to visit, or people that worked with my dad. And so, there was a lot of, kind of a knowledge and the discovery, but also, wayfinding. There was a way for me to get back from elementary school that I knew. And so I can even imagine it now. Like I can imagine all the turns I had to take, and it helps your navigation skills when you're a kid. And then you grow up understanding navigation. And when you're old, when you're older and you had a ton of time where your parents were taking you around in a car, you don't have that same sense of discovery, and you don't have that same sense of direction finding. And I think that that's important to think about when we're continuing to build these neighborhoods and build these places where you can't walk to school, and so parents have to drive to school, and then there's a whole mess of people driving around the kids' school. And unfortunately, like in a place like Lafayette, around the corner from where my parents live now in California, there was a parent who was killed, who was hit by a car after school. Those types of things happen when there's so many cars around. And when there's just bikes and walking going to school, you don't have to worry about that. My middle school, even in Houston, we biked to school. And I walked that the elementary school was actually 2 doors down from my house, so that wasn't really a big deal. But the middle school, I biked to school. And all of the trails were underpasses that went over main roads and stuff. So we never actually got anywhere near cars. And so there's just, there's less ability of cars to damage kids. There's more ability for kids to get some really cool experience out of the deal. Okay, SEPTA ends King of Prussia project. Before I say this, when I say listen in on Thursday for Yona and I talking, because we mentioned this project. But SEPTA canceled its King of Prussia rail extension after the Federal Transit Administration passed on awarding the agency funding for the project. The project was expected to cost $3 billion and only serve around 10,000 riders. But the cancellation also boosted hopes of local advocates hoping to reconsider the Roosevelt Boulevard subway, which has been getting more attention and recent press coverage. This was by Tom Fitzgerald in the Philadelphia Inquirer. I will say that $3 billion for 10,000 is a waste of money. That's just what it is. Same thing with $7 billion for a half-mile, subway between 4th and King Station and the Transbay Terminal. And you'll hear me rant more about this on Thursday when Yona comes on. But I just think that we shouldn't be wasting money on projects like this that actually cost a lot of money and serve so few riders. Imagine what you could do with that $3 billion in terms of bus service and other things. And I know it's a capital versus operating cost type of thing, but it's still really frustrating. And it's still frustrating that, you could probably this project's still important, I think. I don't think it's not important, but I just don't think that it should cost that much. And I'm really frustrated by these discussions about, it's not whether we should have or build these transit lines, actually. It's actually, why do they cost so much? Why does it cost $3 billion to make a little, a little left turn and go to, a main downtown in Pennsylvania? It doesn't make any sense to me why that would cost $3 billion. And I think that, is being discussed throughout the country, but maybe not discussed fast enough. And there's a lot of things we need to do to fix that. But it's canceled, and maybe they can focus on an even more important project, which is the Roosevelt Boulevard subway. But then they'll have to discuss about how to keep costs on that low too, because that's going to be an issue. Red states' preemption of blue cities increasing. States with more Republican elected officials are clashing with cities that elect Democrats and support their policies. States around the country are seeking to limit policies such as rent stabilization, minimum wage, and school curriculum. Many of the topics are turned are turned into politics and culture war issues, but could also have corrosive effect on democracy if people with more local issues feel their voices can't be heard by legislators at higher levels of government. This is by Monica Potts in 538. There's so much of this going on in states all over the country. I just saw today there was an article about how the Tennessee legislature is trying to, make Nashville's life a living hell, and they already, redistrict them away from a blue representative in Congress. They are also trying to, get rid of runoff elections, because what would happen if there weren't any runoff elections is the Democratic vote would get split among all the people that were running, and then maybe Republicans could sneak in and be the mayor of a city that didn't want them. And so, I think that it's really frustrating to see what's going on in Texas, in places like in Tennessee, even in Georgia, where they might be okay with, parts of cities seceding from other cities. It just doesn't make any sense to me that there should be so much negative actions in one direction going from red states to blue cities. And it's frustrating to see all that preemption over dumb stuff too. I mean, lots of stuff is like personal freedoms and labor laws and stuff like that. I mean, Texas, give me a break, Texas. Like, why would the legislature say that all of your labor laws aren't allowed unless we actually pass a labor law? Like, this is a state where the legislature isn't even in session all the time because it's not their full-time job. They do other things in their cities. And so, part-time legislature that doesn't know anything about how cities work, which is frustrating, is legislating labor laws for cities. Give me a break. So I probably have more to say on that at some point in the future, but it's just really frustrating to hear all the stuff that's going on from a preemption standpoint. And, there's an argument that says that, and I talked with Trevor Latimer about this too. There's an argument that says that, it goes both ways, that, liberal states do this for more conservative cities. And I guess you could say about California when it comes to, housing and things like that. So those types of issues are the ones that, where you're expanding what you can allow, what places allow, what they allow property owners to do versus, restricting what property owners can do, restrictions versus allowances. So there's that too. But anyways, that's a whole other topic. We'll get to that at some point in the future, I'm sure, talking about this preemption issue, which is really frustrating for a lot of cities right now. Mapping more sidewalks in cities. Researchers from multiple universities have created an open source tool that maps sidewalks in cities using aerial photos and recognition software. Most cities don't have comprehensive data on sidewalks, so this could be a welcome addition for planners and city officials seeking to repair or bolster sidewalks or focus their efforts on active transportation in climate change efforts. This is by Peter Ditziks in MIT News. This was by Andres Sivtsuk, who we'd had on the show talking about his book Street Commerce a few years ago. Really cool stuff that they're doing, allowing cities to figure out, through aerial photos where their sidewalks are, mapping them, figuring out where the breaks are, where some of the gaps are in the system. Really cool stuff, really cool mapping that they're doing over there. And I really appreciate that. And finally, in the main section, dead electric car batteries' second lives are powering cities. Once electric car batteries outlive their useful life in electric cars, they're still useful in other ways and can keep about 80% of their charge. This allows them to be used for more applications such as solar storage or powering streetlights or elevators. And more and more electric cars, as more and more electric cars are manufactured, there's a need to figure out what happens to their batteries after their usefulness to cars is up. This was by Peter Jung in Reasons to be Cheerful. Really good idea. And, once car batteries are used up, which is, doesn't mean they're used up, they're just used up to cars. They can be used for other things, for like storing energy for, like they said, elevators, or storing energy for buildings or whatever it might be. You can still use those batteries. They just aren't going to be available to cars. So as we go through these life cycle things, as we can figure out how to use these materials that we've created for electric vehicles, we should be recycling them or figuring out ways to use them again. And I think this is a really cool thing, a really cool way. Okay, so we have several bonus items here from the newsletter that I thought were interesting, but just didn't attract as much attention as the articles at the top. But I still think they're important, and I wanted to re-highlight them here. A new Colorado state government program is funding community improvements to prevent crime. By giving communities funds to improve sidewalks, put up fencing and lighting, and clean up neighborhoods, they're hoping to focus on ways to prevent crime rather than funding response mechanisms. This was in Rocky Mountain PBS. So basically, the state is funding interventions that are hoped to reduce crime, and these are urban design interventions, not necessarily hiring more police officers, which I think is a really interesting way. When we're talking about reforming the police department, there's a lot of things you can do where you don't have to hire officers, but you can still do things that allow for kind of some reform. So things like that have been happening, like crisis, response, where mental health professionals will respond to crisis, people in crisis, rather than police officers. You have these types of situations where the state of Colorado, which has been doing lots of really cool stuff lately, giving grants to areas. Basically, if there's an empty lot that's been causing trouble, they can actually, give them funding to spruce it up a bit and make it so that it's not, a haven for nefarious activity and things like that. So, design applications rather than enforcement applications. Sampo Heitinen believes that in order for mobility as a service to thrive, it has to evolve to be something different than it's conceived of now. Change in mobility patterns can't be left up to transportation companies that have only their own interests in mind, but rather could come from adjacent businesses that see the importance of mobility. This was in ITS International. So when we talked to David Henscher, Sampo actually wrote the article with David that I talked to David about. And so I think this is Sampo's addition to that in ITS International. Click on the link in the show notes to read this if you listened to last week's show and you kind of wanted in words what David was talking about. I think that's really interesting. I still think it's something that maybe states can try or cities can try, with the help of credit card companies and insurance companies and the like. In other news, housing costs are driving 70% of the rise in the consumer price index, one of the ways that we measure inflation. And if you dive deeper into the index calculation, the driver of housing, which makes up 25% of the index, is a measure called the owner's equivalent rent. OER, as I'm taking owner's equivalent rent and changing it into an acronym, takes all owner-occupied housing and calculates how much rent there would be if they were rented out, which is insane. It's a crazy calculation. But that doesn't even exist because people in these homes own them outright or have fixed or mostly fixed mortgages. But the worst part about OER is that it's typically a lagging indicator, which means that it impacts show up like years later in the index, maybe a year later, actually, not years. Apparently, the Federal Reserve uses a different metric to calculate inflation and is now supposedly going to focus less on housing. But the rate hikes that result from inflation calculations are going to have long-lasting effects on housing, especially in a market caused by local restrictions that have happened over decades. And so I'm wondering, can we plug zoning codes into the index, into the inflation index? No, we can't. And this is something that happens over time. And, even though the Fed is saying that they're not taking housing into account as much when they're talking about inflation, apparently they're still, struggling with inflation, but it makes up so much, housing makes up so much of the calculation that it doesn't make any sense that they're continuing to raise rates, and which is basically going to make people lose jobs, and all of the, the capitalists are going to, crave all companies do job cuts because they feel like they can do the same amount of work for less money and things like that. So all the tech companies are following suit. A bunch of other companies, I'm sure, will follow suit later. You're going to see a lot of job layoffs and stuff, and all because of the Fed and all because of our zoning restrictions. That's my take. But I think that over time, these zoning restrictions have led to housing construction issues, have led to housing shortages, have led to an acute housing cost issue that leads to the Fed wanting to keep hiking rates because they think it's overheated. When it's not overheated, it's undersupplied. That's the problem. Also, if you're on the West Coast, earthquakes are always at the back of your mind. The recent earthquake in Turkey revealed what happens if your codes and standards aren't up to snuff. 20,000 people died as 3,100 buildings fell in Antakya. 80% of the buildings that remain are likely to need to be torn down and replaced. That's a stunning fact and belies the need to be honest about where things really stand when it comes to codes and public safety. This was a shocking New York Times article to me. I really, really think that I hope all of our codes are up to snuff because this is terrifying and scary. 20,000 people died in this, and in all these buildings falling, and it's because they weren't built correctly on an earthquake fault. It's frustrating. That didn't have to happen. And, the person in charge of Turkey right now, Erdogan, wants to rebuild as fast as possible. But, why don't you wait a second and see what your codes will withstand. I mean, you really need to think about this closely and hard before you start rebuilding stuff that could just get taken down the next earthquake. Statewide in California, 5% of Medi-Cal patients account for 44% of the program's cost. Many of those patients lack stable housing, which makes matters worse. California is hoping that the federal government will ease rules related to how Medicare funding is used to allow temporary payment of rent for some of these patients. Even with expensive rents, this could actually lower healthcare spending. This is something related to transportation as well. Often without stable transportation, appointments are missed and opportunities for care are lost. And sometimes a missed appointment costs multiples of the transportation cost. All of these things are connected. And so that's crazy. 5% of Medi-Cal patients account for 44% of the program's costs. That is a lot. And also that's because they're staying in the hospital instead because they don't have the housing that they need. And so I don't think, because you can imagine how much Medi-Cal is spending, billions of dollars, 44% of that, and much of that is because of people lacking housing are going into the system. If you allow Medicare or Medi-Cal to be used for, at the most, this is the rules that they're trying to ask for, is 6 months tops for rent. That's maybe $2,000 to $3,000 a month, when each of their stays is probably costing the system like $30,000, $40,000, $50,000. So $2,000 to $3,000 a month is a drop in the bucket compared to what it costs to maintain them in a hospital bed for that long. And so, the same thing with transportation. If you can do little things to help people get to where they're going for their medical appointments, you're actually saving money for the system. We can actually reduce costs by doing these little things. And this is a systemic, basically society-wide issue. If we gave more people housing, or allowed them access to housing at least for reduced costs, and they can have jobs and spend money, and it doesn't cost $3,000 for a housing unit per month, then we get rid of a lot of all these other problems. We can actually reduce the cost of healthcare. We can reduce the cost of services. We can reduce a lot of things. And so this is all systemic and it's all connected. And I wish more people would pay attention to this connected nature, but they don't. They're just like, oh, this is a healthcare problem. This is a transportation problem. This is a housing problem. No, they're all connected. It's all part of the same coin. And I really think that if we start to think about these as a systemic issue, housing is a systemic issue, transportation is a systemic issue, you'll get to solve more problems than you knew actually existed. The Jones Act is a U.S. maritime law that restricts shipping between U.S. ports to U.S.-built and flagged ships. The law is one of the most restrictive shipping laws in the world, and also drives a lot of freight rail and road traffic on the East Coast. So this is the thing. The Jones Act basically allows U.S.-based ships with U.S. flags on their hulls to be the only ones that carry materials between U.S. ports. You can carry something from a foreign port to a U.S. port, but you can't carry things between two U.S. ports unless it's a U.S. ship. And so what that means is that instead of, shipping, building ships and using them to transport things up and down the eastern seaboard, they send them on rail, freight rail, and on the roads as well. So you get this massive amounts of traffic because of this Jones Act, which it doesn't really make sense in the 21st century. There's a lot of people that will try to defend it, but at the same time, if we had more shipping available, we wouldn't have as much traffic on the East Coast. That's basically what this piece is saying in the Atlantic. And I think that probably makes a lot of sense. Kansas City prevented hundreds of evictions by funding attorneys to represent tenants in the area. Before the program, 99% of tenants would have faced eviction. Now, 91% of cases where the program represents tenants, 91% get to stay in their homes. KCUR. In Lima, Peru, nets are strung out all along the city, especially on the coast, where they are used to catch moisture from thick fogs. As the city is technically in a desert, the fog generated from the ocean is a way to collect more precious water. National Geographic. UCLA professor Vinit Mukhija believes the current way we do things is unfair, and with unpermitted accessory dwelling units in places like LA getting more scrutiny in poorer neighborhoods, there's a lesson from informal settlements around the world on how to help upgrade housing that already exists or could exist with a bit more adaptation. This was in UCLA News. This is an interesting article. I wasn't sure about it when it first came onto my radar, but when I read the article, which is how really interesting this is, when I read the article, I was like, oh yeah, that makes a lot of sense. He's basically saying, like, in the the slums and the shanty towns around the world, there's formalization patterns. So some of the places have actually tried to put infrastructure in these areas so that people could actually formalize their settlement patterns, settlement units. And then what happens though in the US is that we have all these ADUs and stuff, and we were trying to approve them, right? We're trying to approve them at the state level that you can build ADUs, but there's all these illegal ADUs because people were trying to fit more people into the land because of the expensive housing situation in California. And so there's a lot of illegal units, which, you need to fix those. But the ones that are targeted for enforcement aren't in the rich areas; they're in the poor areas, and that's unfair to everybody if things aren't held to the same standard in poor and rich areas. And so I think that's interesting that there's lessons from the standardization of infrastructure, the formalization of settlement patterns in other countries that are similar to here. You just don't think about it that much, but it actually occurs. A new paper from the American College of Cardiology found in time series research that people living next to noisy roads were more likely to have higher blood pressure. It wasn't just nitrogen pollution that was connected to the outcome, but the dose of noise. This was in CNN, the dose of noise. So how much noise they were getting was how much connected to higher blood pressure they were. So it wasn't just the pollution from particulates or pollution from CO2 emissions. It was actually noise pollution. And finally, because I can't put this comment in Puppies and Butterflies because it's a sad one, I wanted to put it here. We lost a redwood tree behind my house on Saturday. It was part of a 3-tree stand, maybe 4, because I think that there's a redwood on the front side of this apartment building, but a 3-tree stand that's probably been there for over 100 years. It wasn't dead or dying, and it wasn't leaning over, but the landowner behind us thought because of all the trees falling lately, because of all these atmospheric rivers, that it posed a danger. They had been cutting back the roots of this redwood. They already topped it off many years ago. I don't know if the landowner actually did that, but somebody topped these redwood trees so that they couldn't grow any taller. And they were cutting the roots to keep it from getting under the 1970s apartment building that he owns next to the Victorian house that he lives in. So I'm sure residents complained about it breaking up the parking concrete behind the building. He was, I guess, worried about it falling over in a storm. But it didn't look unhealthy. It didn't look like it needed to be cut down. And I'll say that until I die. And you all know me. I always complain on this show when a tree disappears or gets cut down. We talk with Lynn Peterson about trees and why, there's no reason to cut them down in a transportation setting. And we had a ficus tree in front of the house that got hit by a box truck that I had to take down because it was actually in danger of falling over. The stump was cracked in half, the stem was cracked in half, and it was going to fall at some point in the next week or so if we didn't do anything about it. So we did. We cut it down, and now there's a nice pistache tree that's coming up in its place. But it's still sad that a mature tree has to go. But, now 2 trees are without friends, and you can laugh at me about that comment, but redwoods are family trees. They do better together in groups. If you've ever been to, the sequoias in the forest, or you've been to the redwoods in Northern California, you know that they grow in stands. You know that there's a mother tree, and maybe when that tree disappeared, other trees will, grow up around it. And they do actually talk to each other. They talk to each other underground. This has been found in research that the trees can warn each other about parasites across the forest. Their roots are enmeshed, making them less likely to tip over. They also sequester more carbon than new trees or new plantings, which I'm not against new trees or new plantings because I want more trees and I want more plants. But the old growth trees, the trees that have history, sequester more carbon. They take better care of the environment. They're better for you mentally, I believe, as well. And we had Professor Michael Newman on the show for episode 392, and he talked about how we could learn a lot from the sustainability of trees, how they're a system upon themselves. They grow their leaves in the spring, and then they drop them, and then the leaves drop and nourish the tree again. And, it lives off of the land. It is interconnected with its community. And they've been around for millions and millions of years, and we haven't been here anywhere close to that long. And I think that it shows sometimes when stuff like this happens. But, none of this mattered to the landowner, who has a horrible record of tree cutting and tenant relations, if I'm being honest, and, just another person that doesn't get it. And the person in the unit behind us probably had to put up their shades for the first time in a long time because they were getting sun that they wouldn't usually get before they could see a redwood tree. Now they only see a parking lot and the houses behind them. There is another redwood back there, which is a beautiful tree, and I know the landowners are not those landowners specifically are not going to take that one down. But I'm sad and I'm angry. Frustrated. He says he told a neighbor that he had an arborist come out and take a look at it. I don't think that arborist is probably worth their salt if they're cutting down a redwood that didn't seem to be posing any danger. So I think we could have saved it if we had registered the stand of trees with the city of San Francisco as significant. I didn't know that I would have to do that, and I didn't know that they would be stupid enough to cut down a tree that big and that old. But I was wrong, and I really wish I wasn't. So they cut the tree down, they cut down the branches, and then they cut down in tabs. And I don't know if that tree got wasted and just was mulch. It should have been used for other purposes. If not, it was a beautiful tree, and it was a good friend of the neighborhood. So farewell, friend, you'll be missed. This week and every week, I want to thank our generous Patreon supporters. Sorry to do this after a bummer, but I do care about that stuff. I really do care about what happens in our natural environment, and redwood trees are so beautiful and they're so majestic and important. So, anyways, you guys are awesome. You keep the show going. You listen to my rants about trees. You support each month, and I really appreciate it. The show specifically and Talking Headways wouldn't be here without our Patreon support. So thank you all very much. We really do appreciate it. You can support the show by going to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. We've had people sign up each month during this pandemic that we're still in, apparently. So we're super appreciative of that. $2 a month will get you some stickers, including our Cars or Cholesterol sticker, and $10 a month will get you one of our scarves. And tell me which scarf you want when you get to that $10 level. Also, I want to mention we did produce an audiobook version of Raymond Unwin's 1909 classic, Town Planning and Practice. Go to raymondunwin.com to get your audiobook copy. And also, if you have a comment or question, feel free to tweet at us or comment on any of the social sites where the podcast appears. Feel free to email us at theoverheadwire@gmail.com. Also, if you have complaints about the advertisements that actually happen in front of this podcast, please do send me those. I have asked Libsyn in the past to not put political advertising in the front of this show, and apparently it's happened, and I heard it. So I've asked them to stop that if possible. I don't know. Sometimes they sneak them in, I guess, but maybe it's not even Libsyn's fault. Maybe it got classified by somebody else who was trying to sneak in some local ad somewhere. So apologies for that. And, we're not supposed to have political ads on the front of this show, just fun stuff. Hopefully it's just, something like mocha frappuccinos or something. I don't know. But even Starbucks is driving me crazy lately with their anti-union stuff. So anyways, let me know. Give me an email. Send me an email if you have any questions, comments, or complaints, theoverheadwire@gmail.com. Okay, puppies and butterflies. This is the part of the show where we talk about something fun, interesting, or maybe it just didn't fit in any other sections. And so my wife and I have been watching The Bad Batch and Mandalorian, and I can say this year that we're going to have a May the 4th episode, May the 4th be with you, about Star Wars, which will be a Talking Headways show. I'm really, really looking forward to recording that. I'll share more information when it becomes available. Also have been making some really good fajitas lately. I know that doesn't make a lot of sense. Hey, let's share our cooking tips, but I got a really good recipe that we've been enjoying. So feel free to email me if you want the recipe, theoverheadwire@gmail. Actually, I'll just put it in the show notes. I'll put it in the show notes. We'll put the fajita recipe in the show notes for the end of the show. So lots of good food, lots of fun, seeing family, doing that type of thing. It's been good, kind of getting out a little bit more in the pandemic, having beers with friends. Really appreciate that too. Just kind of trying to get out a little bit more and be out of the house, and being stuck inside for such a long time, for so many years. And as an introvert, I do appreciate being inside, but not that much necessarily. So in any event, you can find me on Twitter at @theoverheadwire, at theoverheadwire.com. You can find me on Mastodon too at theoverheadwire, at SFBA Social. I did post about the trees. You can actually see pictures of before and after. I woke up on Saturday morning and heard them cutting it down. So I tried to take a picture of what was there before they took the whole thing. And I think you'd be in anger too if you saw kind of what that was. So I took pictures. I put them up on my Mastodon. Check it out if you get a chance. Also, check out Mastodon for my other takes, which are most read items and interesting articles. So thank you all for joining us at Mondays at the Red Wire. Thanks to our generous patrons for sponsoring this week's podcast. We really, really appreciate you. I hope that you all have a wonderful, wonderful 2 weeks before we talk to you again. We'll see you next time.
Talking Mondays.